Hello everyone, and welcome back to another ESO video. Today I want to talk about consistency versus what's best. This is a little bit of an ESO philosophy, a way of thinking about the game. So when we're talking about consistency versus what's best, a lot of it has to do with the context of trial builds, dungeon builds in general. A lot of players have opinions. A lot of players do a lot of research to figure out what's best, and then they make recommendations based on that information that they find. And I guess I kind of wanted to talk about what I view as a bit of a trap. Oftentimes, while well-intentioned, this advice can be given towards newer players or less experienced players that don't necessarily need to know what's best. It would be much better for them to know what is consistent. A lot of this is based on the idea that if you know what is consistent and you can experience content with a consistent basis, eventually you can get better and transition into what's best. Now, I do believe that there is a best way to approach things in ESO. There's a lot of differences between the classes, between the races, and anytime that you have differences, you're going to end up with options that are better than other options. And anytime that you have options that are better than other options, you eventually have an option that is considered best, or you end up with options that are at a similar tier to the point where, while there might not be a best, these options are better than these other options. And this is a good thing, because not only are the classes different and the play styles and so on and so forth, the problems that you run into in the game are often different as well. Some situations will call for instance, high damage, single target, ranged burst, right? I think of VAS. When protectors come out, you need to be able to kill the protectors as quickly as possible. And in order to do that, usually you need some form of ranged burst damage. This is why Nightblades are often considered so strong in VAS, as well as Sorks. And so having these different problems allows the different classes and races to shine, because you can use the different classes and races to solve different problems. Now, always in the back of your head, it's good to keep in mind that best is often subjective and not objective. Subjective meaning open to interpretation, objective meaning not open to interpretation. It's a fact. And so what it's often considered best, especially in the context of ESO, is subjective. It's very hard to really prove something in ESO, or really anything where people are involved, and skill expression needs to be accounted for, as well as biases that can result in data. Also, in ESO, there's tons of variables. And I believe something to think about or to address quickly is that certain variables are taken into consideration more often than other variables. So highly considered variables would be things like logs, especially from some of the best teams. Dummy parses are often highly considered. And then a lot of people will take into account fight types. Do I need some level of cleave in this fight? Is it all single target? Is it all single target ranged burst, right? And then minimally considered variables are things like, what kind of classes does a player prefer? That's not, once you reach a certain level, it's a back burner item. Usually groups and players like to accommodate each other. But oftentimes there is a level of, we need this class, we need these gear sets, and so on and so forth. Other minimally considered variables, anecdotal evidence. So if a player claims that something is good in a certain fight, that doesn't always mean that it is good, and people usually believe that or adhere to that as a rule. And context, I put it under minimally considered variables because I like to look at worst case scenarios. I believe if you look at worst case scenarios, you'll be always prepared for the best case scenarios. So worst case scenario is someone tells you to run this, it's the best, and they take into account zero context. That's a worst case scenario. And so oftentimes context falls under this minimally considered, and I'm taking it into account as minimally considered here. Now, I want to talk about two different types of consistency. So the first type is what I call Cliff Young consistency. And this is going to feel like a bit of a tangent, but I'll reel it back in. In 1983, a potato farmer by the name of Cliff Young won the Australian ultramarathon. And he didn't just win it. He broke the world record for ultramarathons. Now, at the time, he was racing against some of the greatest athletes in the world. These are sponsored athletes. They're showing up with clothing and apparel that is tailor-made for this competition, representing whichever company is sponsoring them. These runners have trained however many years for this run. Cliff Young, he never trained for the run, but on his potato farm, his family also owned sheep, and when storms or other disasters would be on their way, he would need to go and herd those sheep, which would often involve running for something between 2 to 4 days straight. So he was 61 years old, showed up in his first pair of running shoes and windbreaker pants that he'd cut holes into himself to get a little bit more ventilation. And he had a very unique running style, which I'm just going to refer to as the Cliff Young Shuffle. This is an example of consistent strategy, or the strategy that the rest of the world, having practiced, was not actually the best strategy in the world. And we can run into that from time to time on ESO. And I wanted to put it out there for you to think about. I'm not going to linger on it too much longer, though, because typically when strategies are being determined or usurped in ESO, it's after a high level of consistency or achievement has already been made with the standard strategies, and players are just bored and want to try something new. But that's most often when something unique or spectacular evolves the way that a trial is run. So the second type of consistency I want to talk about is what I call Thrashian consistency. So let's take into account a solo arena, whether it's Vatashran or VMA. If you look at scores alone, you may be led to believe that Thrashian Stranglers is the best mythic item for solo arenas. And this might be outdated as of now. We are on the High Isle patch, and we haven't seen any spectacular scores or any time for the new meta to evolve. But going into High Isles, looking at scores for solo arenas, you may be led to believe that Thrashian Stranglers is the best mythic item for solo arenas. Now, anyone who does not run Maelstrom Arena for score and doesn't care about score in Maelstrom Arena would probably be laughing at such a concept as Thrashian Stranglers being the best mythic item. Because score is not the only variable that you should take into account when considering Vatashran or Maelstrom. Other variables to take into consideration is How many deaths is someone getting per run? How many first completes were done with this specific mythic? And last but not least, how many broken controllers and monitors and keyboards have been created while running this mythic? If we take all of these other variables or pieces of data into account, what we might find out is that the Pale Order Ring is the best mythic item for running solo arenas, or Death Dealer's Fate, or this new mythic, Oakensoul. These are very strong mythic items, and while they may not create the best scores, they may create the most consistent experience. And it can't be overstated how important creating consistency is and building confidence in new content is before you start going for gold. So that's my second instance of consistency, is Thracian consistency. While Thracians might be the best, they're probably not going to help you get your first clear. If you want your first clear, Pale Order Ring, Death Dealer's Fate, and the new Oakensoul are probably your go-tos. I want to end with the thought that context is everything. So certain situations are going to be better for a higher level of consistency, and certain situations are going to be better for optimizing. A couple offhand prog groups, consistency is really important. Even if you are an experienced player and you want to limit test, it's important to keep in mind that while you're limit testing in a prog group, you might be preventing other people from getting to the point where they can limit test themselves. Let's say you are running a build with no self-heals or no shields because you're trying to push DPS. Not having a shield or a self-heal could prevent you from completing a res in certain situations. And this hurts the prog group and prevents other people from learning. Along the same lines, if you are in a group where someone is learning a new role, it's very important that you bring a high level of consistency. So let's say you're trying to teach a new tank how to off-tank Sunspire hard mode and hold statues. If you're a member of the Portal team and you have to choose between two builds, one where maybe you push more damage, you are able to clear the portal faster, or you're able to help with the trash better, but it sacrifices how consistently you can clear the portal. Let's say with your more sweaty build or less survivable build, you only clear the portal half the time, versus another build where you could clear the portal 9 out of 10 times. It's really important to run that more consistent setup so that you can give your off-tank more experience. That will help them get to where they need to get to so that your group can have more overall success. And then anytime that you're first timing something, I already brought up VMA, where Pale Order is more consistently going to prevent you from dying and allowing you to clear. An example I like to use is Death Dealer's Fate in DLC hard mode dungeons. I really like to run Medusa and False God in DLC hard mode dungeons, and pairing Death Dealer's Fate in this situation causes you not to be able to run full Medusa jewelry. And so even though it might not be the highest damage, I'll run False God and Medusa so that I don't have to worry about keeping up Minor Force, I don't have to worry about sustain, and then the Death Dealer's Fate gives me a high level of survivability by increasing my max stats. And then I'll wear a heavy Medusa chest in place of that Medusa ring, which will also give me increased health, which is the primary stat that I care about when experiencing something for the first time. It lets me make maybe one extra mistake that I otherwise wouldn't be able to make. Situations where optimization is more important than consistency. So we already talked about score pushing. If you're at the point in your VMA career or your trial career where getting a clear doesn't really matter, or getting a trifecta isn't what's important. What's important is how big the number is at the end of the trial. Then you might push more optimization as you want the highest score possible. That's your goal. That's your priority. And so consistency is less important than being able to have the best run you possibly can. And then I included farming down here as well. This is mostly anecdotal. When I'm farming dungeons, let's say I'm farming a dungeon on normal, I don't need to run my Medusa and Death Dealer's Fate setup. I'm going to run a full damage setup with Thrashing Stranglers, and I'm just going to try and beat the crap out of the dungeon as fast as possible. And even if I die, the time that I'm saving on the runs where I don't die will easily offset the time I lose on the runs where I do die. So I listed that down there. That's not a hard rule of thumb. If you're in a trial group where they don't consistently clear a trial and they're farming the trial, you should probably run a more consistent setup. But that's all I had for now. Thanks for tuning in. I hope that I was able to change your perspective or introduce some new ideas. I'll see you in the next one.